All right, we're back at it, and we got our pinion shaft back from the machine shop. Did a very nice job lathing that down, taking 2 millimeters of length off the end of it and 1 millimeter diameter in order to fit the stock bearing. This was actually just another TDI 02J pinion shaft that I gave to him to measure against, so he could double check and make sure he got it exactly the way it should be. So that worked out really well. It cost me about 40 bucks. He said it wasn't too difficult, so yeah, super happy about that. Well, next up now is to start doing some more bearings. We get our diff bearings at least installed on the diff. I still need to do the races into the case, both case halves. I have the back case half ready to go. I still have the bell housing in the parts washer. So that should be ready here shortly. But in the meantime, I'm going to just go ahead and start getting the bearings on the input shaft as well as our pinion shaft that we just got back from the machine shop. And since this one's actually a good bit longer than what I'm used to dealing with, I'm probably going to have to adjust the press. Although I think for doing the large bearing, I can get away with leaving it where it is. Might actually work out better. Ooh, that barely fits in there. Okay, I might have to take that back. Well, I'll go ahead and just lower it now anyway. I'm going to have to do the small bearing on the other end anyway, so we'll just go ahead and do it now. So I got my bearings laid out. The ones with the lips are your input shaft bearings. The ones that don't have them, these are our pinion bearings. This is going to go press into the bell housing. This other one actually presses into the bearing plate for the pinion shaft. Actually, I need to remove these old O-rings too. I got new O-rings to go on, so we're going to get rid of these O-rings while we're at it. And then once we get all of our bearings installed and bearing races installed on the cases, the case halves, we'll go ahead and check the free play of the differential, the input shaft, and the pinion shaft. And we will get our preload calculated, get the right size shims installed, and at least for the pinion shaft and the differential, I have a friction torque double check I can do to make sure I'm in the correct preload window. The input shaft is actually not preloaded at all. It's actually supposed to be ever so slightly loose. It's supposed to spin super easy and freely, and should be a very minimal detected amount of play, but it should be, you might be able to feel like the tiniest clunk if you were to pull back and forth on it with the correct amount of preload, but you won't actually really see much movement. So that's that story there. I'll press that into that case later there. Let's do our pinion shaft for right now. You know, I think I'll double stack these guys. Another good trick, if you're looking for a very specific sized adapter when pressing bearings on, you can use the old bearing. You can cut off the cage and you can use the inner race oftentimes. So I think this is, yep, that's the correct one. So it's exactly precisely sized, and then you can put on whatever pieces of tubular steel you got laying around to make it work from there. This one I usually use, that piece for the 5-speed, but obviously just stacked on top here, but it's obviously not going to work with the extended shaft, so I will have to find an intermediate piece of sorts to go on there with it. I might even be able to just use another piece of bearing, right? That's kind of barely on the edge there, but nah, and it's still not long enough. Well, this guy actually I do use for pressing on first and second gear selector shaft pretty frequently, among other things. But let me see if this is going to be, it's kind of fitting on the inside. I don't like that. So, how close are we with that bearing? Could I potentially use that? Oof. Well, I can use the different bearing inner races I got laying around to maybe space that out even further. Maybe that'll be the ticket. Use the big guy here. See, that looks pretty good. But then, this guy is going to be too small, right? Well, you know what I might do instead? If I get another decent sized bearing race. One of the Tuareg ones maybe. Let's space it down just enough for this guy. Ooh, barely. Well, how about this one? Maybe that one will be, that's probably too small. Well, actually it works out okay. Let's try that. That is jankerific, but hey, sometimes you just got to get creative with it. All right, bearing installed. Now the real test. The machine down end of the pinion shaft. Make sure that this bearing will actually go on. Let me find, where is that small adapter I always use? Why is that in here? Well, there's a smaller one that I usually use with that. There it is. There's that sleeve. Ooh, I might have to lose the extra plate there. Now, the machinist did not add the extra large chamfer that's usually there, so this may not start as easily, but so long as it fits snugly and we don't have any clearance issues with the case, we're good. Okay, I think that is that. That looks good. And yeah, look at that. It's only got that tiny bit sticking up above the inner race of the bearing. That's just about as perfect as it gets. And yeah, we are seated all the way. Very good. Okay, that will do the trick. Let's go ahead and grab our input shaft that's sitting over here. Our sync rails are sitting on there. So, let me think here. First things, I need this bearing for the job. And then it was this sleeve that's actually the needle bearing for 5th gear. That's the inner sleeve for that needle bearing. And I'm generally reusing needle bearings unless they look really bad. They're not under load or anything, so it's always, you know, way more important to get the tapered roller bearings, because these are what are under load and do often wear. And it's super critical also to get the preload correct on these things, whereas there's no preload at all for straight roller bearings like that or needle bearings. All right. There's the small one I just had. There it is. Just like so. It's possible I might bottom this out, but So we'll see. Well, that bottomed out. It looks good. Okay, cool. So that's that. Flip it over, get our small front input shaft on there. Leave these for getting pressed into the case later. And similar thing, I have a couple of old input shaft inner race, small input shaft inner races floating around in here for a couple different reasons. One of which is to press on the new bearing. Oop. All right, where did that go? Right there. So, seats perfectly on there. And it also kind of sizes the diameter out just a little bit, so it's actually perfect to use the same sleeve I was just using on the other side. All right, input shaft on. Ready to rock with those bearings. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but all O2A, O2Js, anything in this transmission family, first and second gear on the input shaft are machined as part of the shaft. These are not removable. Now third gear and fourth gear you can remove, and then obviously fifth and sixth as well. There's a little snap ring here that holds third on, and it's actually got splines that twist a little bit. And then fourth gear just straight splines on, and then has bearing, washer, and sleeve that press on over the top of that. So next up, I'm going to press the outer race into our pinion bearing plate, and then I have bearings to press out of the back half of this case, and then I need to go retrieve the bell housing from the parts washer, and then also do that. So I think we'll call it done for the moment. I will go retrieve the bell housing and be back in just a moment. All right, we got our bell housing back. Let's go ahead and get our bearing race pressed onto our bearing plate. And then I need to press out the bearing races from both case halves, install the new races without the shims, and just keep on trucking along. We'll have to measure our free play without the shims and figure out what the preload is supposed to be on each shaft and the differential. All right, found my adapter that I use for pressing on these bearing races. Oop, it's getting a little crooked on me already. Right. Shim that back up. Actually, I might have to kind of help it just a little bit to go start straight. Outer race pressed in there. So let's go ahead and start removing races on the back half here. Let me see here. I'm going to need that guy for the small bearing. Should be this one for the other two. So we got our diff bearing. There is a shim behind this bearing. I'll explain where the shims are now, actually, since we're talking about it. The input shaft bearing shim lives behind this bearing. Differential shim bearing lives behind this one. And the pinion shaft bearing actually lives behind this small bearing race that presses into the bell housing. So there's the shim that was in there originally, the old bearing race in the trash. We'll keep the shim. Let me find another rag. We'll set it aside. Sometimes you find you use the same shim, sometimes you don't. You don't know until you double check, and the chances of that happening here are very, very low because we have a completely different case from a completely different generation, decades apart. So, and we even replaced the differential too, and changing the the bearing style on the pinion shaft. So yeah, very unlikely that we're going to end up using the same shim. There's our input shaft, outer race with the lip on it. The shim came out with it. And this case, this clearly was a transmission that had a pretty nasty event. There was some minor scoring around the fifth gear here, but there was no bearing left whatsoever back here. This is just a plain roller bearing. It's not a tapered roller bearing, so there's no preload to set there. It's just a plain old roller bearing. So we are going to be removing that, and the replacement roller bearing actually comes with this race that actually goes right about there on the end of the pinion shaft. So this guy actually I can just throw out right now because we're not using it. And it's a completely different bearing than what was on our 0A4. They changed the style of bearing there as well. So I believe this sleeve would still fit in there. So that still obviously fits and works. I mean, obviously this came out of this transmission, but I'm fairly certain the original sleeve from the earlier transmissions would also fit, but this bearing is very different. It might even be that they have larger diameter here, and the way it's secured is different as well. So they actually have the snap ring holding this one in, which is not something that they did on the 02J or any of the older ones. And even most of the 0A4s I've messed with, they don't have that bearing. I'm not sure what year it was they changed that, but it might have been among changes that happened as they got into the Mark 7s. But yeah, let's get that sucker out, find the replacement one. There's actually two of those in this kit that I bought. We'll figure out which one's which. There's two different diameters frequently, and I think this one looks like the smaller diameter, which is usually what you end up using on North American 02Js. So let's get this guy out. Let's see. And actually I'll show you the other side of this too. So normally these are staked ever so lightly as well on the 02J. Half the times those little staking marks will come right out as I'm trying to knock the bearing race out. But it's okay, they're generally in there firm enough, and once everything is assembled, they can't really go anywhere anyway. Okay, so there that is. Whole bearing race is removed. And now, get this guy out, remove that inner sleeve. And yep, that was the right size one to select, so very good. We're going to take the sleeve, we're going to put it on top of that washer because that's where it's going to go as I'm pressing everything back on the pinion shaft. Oop, throwing stuff. Here, let me just use this one. This one's longer. And once again, we're selecting an adapter who's only touching the outer race in this case, not trying to touch any part of the bearing inside of that. All right, there's kind of a tone change that happens once a bearing completely bottoms out. It's kind of what I'm listening for. Let's see, so I'm gonna need this tall guy and also that ball joint press adapter top. Oh, it's over here. So I just need to support the bell housing while I'm getting especially this differential bearing in. So grab one of these guys and need our big input shaft bearing. And I use the same size adapter to do both here. And again, we're installing these without the shim that's supposed to go behind them for right now, so we can take our measurements. Okay, in and in, and we got to extract bearings out of our bell housing. The pinion shaft one is obviously going to be a little more fun and require yet more specialty tools. Flip this over. Small one again, and that one. Front input shaft outer race, and our last diff bearing. Next size up. Grab our new races. And we need the big guy again, like so. That went a little bit easier than expected, but this case is also warmer than usual. Yeah, it's in there. Okay, those are in. Now for the extra fun one, that small pinion bearing pressed into the bell housing. All right, we have what's called a blind hole bearing race puller that is going to do the job for us. And since this case is still fairly warm from the parts washer, hopefully this will go fairly smoothly. Sometimes these will fight you. So, put that guy in there. Actually, I need this wrench. I have to unwind it first. I already have it expanded out to its maximum. this one, a little pin on the bottom will kind of bottom out and start digging into the case a little bit. So once I start feeling a little increased resistance, I'll actually stop and then use this top forcing screw to kind of continue turning it while it's starting to pull up on the race, just so I'm not going to make as large of a divot right in the middle of that kind of thin piece of casting. So it's still expanding, and it looks like the bearing is starting to move. Oop. Yeah, that's coming out pretty easy, it looks like. So I probably don't even have to continue trying to tighten that part. I'll just go like this, pull it out the rest of the way, just like so. Oop. Smacking your pinion shaft, not recommended. So there's our outer race. There's a shim that was underneath it. That guy goes in the trash. Now this is the weird one. Volkswagen, on the other two, so the input shaft and the differential, they want you to install the races with no shim at all, and you measure the free play. On the Pinion, it's a little different. They want you to install, I think it's a 0.6 or 0.65 millimeter shim, and then try to measure free play. But 9 times out of 10, there won't be enough free play to measure, so then you're just left guessing what size shim you actually need. So I personally just go without the shim altogether, just like I do for everything else. They do say in the repair manual to add, I think it's 0.2 millimeters to your measurement of free play to get the correct preload. I'm finding on average I'm doing closer to 0.25, occasionally even more, to get the correct friction torque I'm looking for. And once I get to that section, I'll kind of explain what I'm even really talking about and how I found the friction torque information. Because where it comes to the friction torque stuff, it's actually not found in the O2A, O2J, OA4, none of them. None of those manuals from Volkswagen actually give you those specs. But you know which one does? The O2O. And the O2O uses the exact same preload specs for the Pinion and the differential, at least, that the O2A and O2J use. So that's what I just end up using. But before I go pressing that in the rest of the way, this adapter is about right. I try to support this casing for the Pinion, and it looks like this thing's kind of worn down over time, but it used to be, this one was new, was about perfectly flat with the bottom of the bell housing, but I might actually have to start adding maybe a washer or something underneath there to get it about right, so it'll properly support that casting as I'm pressing in the new bearing. I got the tapered washers. Where's the other style? I got flat washers still? No, just more tapered washers, the Belleville washers. Anyway, maybe I just used one of these, or use this guy. It's off-road transmission. So I'll put this guy down here. Be just enough to add a little bit of thickness to our adapter that's trying to support the underside of the Pinion casting. I do like to use the press on this one just because, I don't know, it seems just I have better results. Sometimes you think that one's in all the way and it's not quite. I don't know how better to explain it. It's just my personal experience talking that this one does not always go in all the way when you think it has, especially when you're hammering in the races. Plus, the casting on the bell housing seems to be a little thin just on the other side of this bearing race, so I just feel safer doing this one with the press. It's going a little crooked, but it's going. There we go. I got it. Okay. So that's in with no problem.